So we've got the water pump all tightened down and good to go. The next thing we're gonna do is attach the timing belt tensioner and the idler pulley. You'll notice the orientation of the tensioner. You got this little hole down here. You will slide over this. Pretty straightforward. And then this will attach to that spring that we had earlier. Finger tighten for now is fine. Gonna be the same deal with the idler pulley over here. Always nice to have this new shiny hardware on the front of the engine. I think it just looks great, and the best part is all this is gonna get covered up anyway, and no one will know better except for you and obviously anyone else in the next 60,000 miles that drives this car, because they won't have timing belt or water pump issues. All right, time to swap out that air filter. Really tricky operation here. Let's take care of it while it's exposed. Done. Guys, here's that crankshaft gear that we had to order. This is an OEM Mazda part. So we'll be installing that along with the OEM Mazda Woodruff key. Might as well, I think I kind of wrenched on that one a little too hard, and it's such a cheap part. Why would I want to risk everything? So let's go ahead and install these two parts. So I had a little difficulty sliding the crank gear back on. So I'm actually sanding down some of this corrosion that's on the crank. It was not going on at all. Okay, next thing I'm gonna do is actually use some of this no corrode battery gel, and I want that under there so I don't get any future corrosion. So I'm gonna smear that liberally around the crank, and hopefully that'll be enough of a measure to keep it from getting all corroded again. Do not forget your Woodruff key. Go ahead and put that fella right in a position. Should sit right there. Okay, hopefully this will slide on a little better now. Make sure you line up obviously your marks. Again, this thing just does not want to slide over the crank. I don't want to force it obviously, but it's kind of a little bit ridiculous how it doesn't fit. All right guys, here's our current situation. We do have the timing belt pulley back on the crank there. We also, as you can see, the Flying Miata tool is in place, and I apologize greatly, because this was an ordeal to get that timing belt gear back on the crank there. Now, if you guys think the new one's just gonna simply slide on your crank, you are wrong. Chances are, it's not gonna fit. So what I ended up doing is put it in a toaster oven at 350 degrees for about 20 minutes. And that got it nice and warm, nice and expanded, and slid on pretty easily. Right over the Woodruff key, right in place. Awesome. The next thing you have to do is get that on there quick before it starts to chill. And it chills quick. As soon as it touches that colder crankshaft, it's gonna start constricting. So you don't have much time. Go ahead and get this timing belt guide. Get that on, get your crank bolt, and tighten that thing down to spec while it's still able to be moved. To do so, you're gonna find, before you can hit the 120 foot-pound mark that this needs to be set at, your crank's gonna move, and it's gonna rotate the crank. You're gonna see your timing marks get off. You need something to lock it in place. That's why this Flying Miata tool is amazing. Just brace it against the water pump neck like I've done here, and you can get the 120 foot-pounds on this all day. It uses two of the existing crank pulley bolts that hold the crank pulley on there. That's the way to do it. Now I'm completely up to torque spec. Now in tightening, you will see your timing marks here move. So I'm slightly ahead, which is fine. Don't panic. Remember, you can always rotate the crank, put the car in neutral, rotate the crank a full turn around. So don't panic if when tightening the crank turns, just bring it back around and you'll get top dead center again. You want to do that before you put the cams back together, right? So that's where we currently are. Go ahead and remove this tool and then get the timing belt ready to go back on. We're gonna start up by loosening these two 10mm bolts. We're gonna take the Flying Miata crank holding tool out. There we go, excellent tool. Time to put our cam gears back on. As you can see, the new gaskets look great. Let's go ahead and put these back on. Let's go ahead and tighten these on. These are 14mm. Perfect. And as you can see, things do move around a little bit when you tighten these things up, so keep that in mind. You gotta be flexible on this job, guys. Don't think you can set everything and not have to go back and double check your work. You will have to double check. Now I know what you're thinking. Wow, he already tightened this on and he didn't put the timing belt on. And that's fine. Like I said, my concern was making sure this timing belt pulley goes on the crank all the way and is tightened all the way to spec before it cools down and might have got stuck a little bit out. So what we're gonna do now is pull this crank bolt out again, slide this plate off, and get that timing belt under there. I know it seems weird what I did, but to get that gear where it needs to be, you need to have this whole assembly bolted in. We're gonna go ahead and connect the Flying Miata holding tool again. This thing is invaluable since we need to break that crank bolt loose again. Okay, this should give us the resistance we need. Get your handy dandy breaker bar out with the 21mm socket, and we're gonna hopefully break this thing loose. Remember, we did set it to 120 foot-pounds. There we go. Woo! 120 foot-pounds of torque is quite a bit to overcome, but once you break it loose, easy street, guys. Ta-da! Awesome! New timing belt time! I think this goes without saying, but you want to have no tension on your tensioner. That pun was intentional. So make sure that's slid all the way in, and just kind of finger tighten it. Take all the weight off that spring, and it'll make putting the timing belt on that much easier. Alright, very cool. Time to fit this timing belt on. And it's time to put our timing belt guide cover back on. It only installs one way. Look for the keyway slot here. Hand tighten that crank bolt all the way down. Time to use our magical tool again, and we'll be tightening it, so we need to definitely put it on this side. So I didn't capture that whole ordeal on film, but I basically, when you torque down the timing belt guide here, it's gonna cause the crank to move. It doesn't matter. Fifth gear, emergency brake on, like I said. So I used the Flying Miata tool and tightened it in. And you can always, once you get it tightened, you can adjust the crank slightly afterwards. So if it just goes forward a little bit from this little mark down here, just back it up a little bit. Now, clearly, we still need to time the engine. Everything looks good. So I look in this order usually. I look at the crank, I look at the exhaust cam, and then I look at the intake cam. As you guys can clearly see, the crank timing marks are lined up perfectly. You can see that little arrow that's cast into the side of the oil pump. Since our crank timing mark is good and our exhaust timing mark are good, we're gonna go ahead and zip tie the exhaust cam in place. And now what we're gonna do is slide the belt off of here and rotate this backwards, just that one tooth. You want to make sure you still keep that tension here. You can also use your friend the cardboard and wedge it down in there to keep it from moving. Go ahead and slide that timing belt back on. Let's see how we look. I think it still needs to come back another tooth. Let's count just to double check. 18. We still need another tooth, so we almost got it. Let's try that again. We have the timing belt on, and all our timing marks are lined up. Now don't get frustrated during this step, guys. Obviously your 3 timing marks need to be aligned. I promise you, when you go ahead and put that new belt on, whether it be through the action of loosening your crank bolt, or when you take the camshafts off and you have to replace the cam seals, something's gonna go off. Even if your engine was perfectly timed before, something is gonna move. It's either gonna move a tooth over here on your exhaust cam, or your crank's not gonna be lined up with either one. Logically go through this, guys. I always like to start with the crank, make sure the crank's lined up. It's pretty easy. The arrow on the oil pump has to line up with that crank pulley notch. And then go ahead and go to your exhaust next. Make sure your exhaust line, you're not necessarily looking for straight up and down here, guys. These marks are the important ones. This notch on this tooth is what you need to line up with this diagonal line here. Same deal with the intake side. Now, if you're off on the intake side or either side, you just remove the belt on that side, use your ratchet to kind of rotate it counterclockwise or clockwise, whichever direction you need to move to get that lined up. Once you get it good here, I like to use zip ties. Zip tie this bad boy in place. take your belt off the intake cam and then rotate that so the marks line up. And then go ahead and put your belt on. The whole time you're doing this, you should have the tensioner pulley loose. That way you have a little bit more play in the belt. And the next thing you're gonna do, once you get all these tightened up and everything's lined up, is you wanna make sure your tensioner is good. The amount of tension on the belt. You're gonna turn the crank pulley a few revolutions to get that slack out. Then you're gonna tighten your tensioner pulley and you should be good to go. Of course, when you finish doing that, make sure nothing moved. Make sure your timing marks are still good to go. 1, 2, and 3. As you can see, we have a perfectly timed engine here. Also check deflection on the belt. It states a certain number of degrees. It should have this little bit of play. Don't be shocked if it does. If you over tighten a timing belt, which is pretty challenging, but you can probably force the tensioner, you're gonna hear a squeal, especially when you accelerate with your car. If you ever hear that, it's a sign that this belt is too tight. Now the opposite can happen. If you have a lot of play here in any of these sections, once the engine starts going through revolutions, you're gonna hear your belt slapping the inside of the timing belt cover. That's an indicator that your timing belt's too loose. So check your deflection points. Now if you can move your belt to a different tooth, that's a whole other issue. You are way too loose. But this is a good way to do it. Perfectly timed engine. Don't risk it. If you don't think your timing's on, keep doing it until it is perfect, because the labor of putting everything back in the front, you saw how long it took to disassemble. You don't want to have to go through that multiple times. So once you have it at this phase, take your time with it, guys. Be patient. Don't let it get inside your head. You got to make sure the 3 marks are there. Count the 19 teeth. That is the ultimate fail-safe to know your timing is good. And then just button this bad boy up and we should have a very well-timed engine ready to perform for us. It's time to put this puzzle back together. We're going to start with our nicely cleaned up timing belt covers here. Those clean timing belt covers look great. What you're looking at right there is the alternator, obviously, and then the alternator tensioning bracket. If you guys remember when I popped that belt off, it simply flew right off. And that's probably why I was getting a lot of belt squeal, because this tensioner's been missing the whole time I've owned the car. So the previous owner didn't tighten the bolts down correctly and it just vibrated loose, which they usually do. It's missing the bolt that goes here, the long bolt that goes on the outside that runs that way, and then I'm missing the block, the bolt block that allows the 2 bolts to tighten each other. So without that, you can't actually tighten down the alternator belt, accessory belt, at its proper tightness. So guess what? Either got to junkyard that or go search on the wide world of internet webs and see if I can track down those parts. And that kind of holds us up here because I can't put all this, you know, electrical wiring and vacuum line nightmare. Oh my good lord, so much to do. I can't do any of that until I get that resolved because the belts need to be on beforehand. So fun. While I'm in here, I did notice a little oil coming back from this, basically just called a cap. It's where the cam angle sensor is on the earlier model Miatas. So they kind of just put this cap here. What it does is it tends to leak over time. And if you're unsure, you can actually feel around. If you feel a nice little slick of oil underneath, that's pretty much the only thing that can leak back there. So go ahead and bust loose these 12 millimeters. There you go, you can just pick the cap up like this. A small inspection mirror helps if you want to see what's going on behind the scenes. Oh, when in doubt, just whip it out. Yeah, it looks like it was certainly leaking. Gotcha, so it kind of uses a bracket behind here that holds tension on this side while you tighten this 1 bolt. So you want to make sure that's lined up. I don't see a reason not to use a little RTV in there to seal it even a little better. I might do that, at least on this half moon section here. That's nice and tight. I'm also going to put a little silicone just right up here, kind of where our valve cover is going to go anyway. Looks pretty good. Time to put the valve cover back on, ladies and gentlemen. Let's go ahead and use our RTV in the sections we should be. Anytime it goes over a cam lobe, I like to do that, especially in the corners where it comes down. And then same back here where this cast cap that we just put on. Spread it into the little cracks. Time to set our valve cover back in there. So you want to employ some kind of crisscross method. You don't necessarily want to just all one side at once or one half at the other side. I have heard stories of valve covers cracking because of that, but yeah, let's just take it easy. As we go, we'll just make sure everything's nice and tight. You also want to do kind of a visual inspection just to make sure that valve cover gasket didn't like slip out, pinch itself when you were installing it. I've seen that happen too, so just give it a good old visual check. Now if you see a part sticking out that looks pinched, that could be definitely an issue. With the valve cover back in place, we can start connecting our various vacuum lines here. Same with the PCV over here. And you've got all these random connectors on the back of the engine. Got a couple things going on here we still need to hook up, but just this is a good time to do that. Again, double check, triple check everything. You don't want to leave any of these connectors undone. Okay, we finally have all the hardware necessary to get the tension correct on the alternator accessory belt. The hardware is actually comprised of 3 components. You've got this long bolt that goes on the bracket, which I fortunately still have on the car. You've got this block here that kind of locks both screws in place, and this is the securing bolt. So pretty cool. Sourced this online, all 3 pieces. So now we can go ahead and get the proper tension on that alternator belt. Really important, it wasn't done before and that's why the belt was squeaking. Plus it was a worn belt, so let's do it right this time and get everything properly tensioned. Belts are all tensioned correctly, have the right amount of deflection, are good to go. So next we're going to go ahead and put the thermostat back in here. But before we do that and put the new gasket on and everything, let's go ahead and clean up this sealing surface here. You just want to make sure you get all the old residue from the old gasket off of there. Place your new thermostat gasket right there, and then go ahead and install your shiny new thermostat spring side in. Connect your upper radiator hose. You're not going to put your radiator in yet because you still have all these connectors to do, but we're just going to do this because this kind of gets buried with all these connectors. So you're going to have one nut to connect the bottom one, and then the bolt goes through and threads to here in the upper. So go ahead and do that and you're good to go.